Ellen White had no use for what she called sour piety. She didn't think that a long face properly represented the Adventist religion. She thought we should be the happiest people on earth. One time her granddaughter, her oldest granddaughter, Ella, was upset about something. And her grandmother said to her, "Ella May, if you could think of a person that had no money, no friends, and was dying of an incurable disease, yet the plan of salvation and the hope of a glorious future should keep that person singing from morning to night." Now, we all sometimes get discouraged, and we do have down days. And Ellen White tells us that when those kind of things happen, what's a very practical way to lift your spirits? Sing a hymn. She encourages us to sing a hymn if we have one of those down days, because, as I said, her view is she had no use for sour piety. We should be happy Seventh-day Adventists. On November 3, 1890, Ellen White was given a very significant vision. The place was Salamanca, New York. She had been there for a few days holding meetings, and either before she got there or while she was there, she came down with a very bad cold, or maybe it was the flu. Anyway, she was very ill. And when she got home that Monday night, November 3, got back to her room where she was staying, she thought she could not go on. She was scheduled to make a number of other appointments, meet a number of other appointments. She just felt she couldn't. She was too sick. But she prayed, and God strengthened her, and during that night, he gave her this significant vision. The next morning, when the people that were traveling with her came to her room, they all assumed we're cutting short the trip, and we're headed back to Battle Creek because Mrs. White had been so ill. But she said, "No, I've been healed." And besides, she said, "I want to tell you about this prophetic dream, this vision that I had last night." But she couldn't remember it. But to show you that she really was healed, not only did they leave Salamanca and go on down into the state of Virginia, this was Salamanca, New York, go on down into the state of Virginia where her next appointments were. While she was down there, she played tourist a little bit. I mean, she was human, so once in a while she liked to play tourist. And she went through the Luray Caverns. And then after the meetings in Virginia, she traveled back up to Brooklyn, New York, and had other appointments in the state of Connecticut and the state of Massachusetts, came back down to Washington, D.C., and didn't actually get home to Battle Creek, Michigan, until December 30th. So it was almost 2 months after she had been so ill and thought she was going to have to cut short her trip. But she's there in Battle Creek, and the General Conference session was held in March, early March of 1891, in the Tabernacle in Battle Creek. And she spoke several times during the General Conference session. On the Sabbath afternoon, March 7, she was featured as the speaker, and 2 or 3 times during her sermon, which was about we shouldn't hide our identity, she was urging us to let people know who we are and not to try to keep it from them that we're Seventh-day Adventists. 2 or 3 times during that talk, she said, several weeks ago, or when I was in Salamanca, some way she was trying to refer back to this vision, this prophetic dream that God had given her, but she could never remember it. And one person that was there wrote later that after 3 or 4 times of trying to recall it, she seemed frustrated with herself and said, "Well, I'll have more to say about that later." It was like, I'm really disgusted with myself that I can't remember that vision. Well, she concluded her talk, and then she had a few words, a short presentation to the ministers. And after the second presentation that afternoon, the one to the ministers, the president of the General Conference, O.A. Olson, said to Ellen White, "Are you planning on coming to the early morning workers meeting?" Now, early morning devotionals, early morning workers meetings really were early in those days. It was at 5:30 a.m. None of this like 7 o'clock or something. This was a 5:30 a.m. devotional. She said, "No," she said, "I think I've spoken several times. I think I'll sleep in tomorrow." So everybody knew Ellen White was not coming to that early morning workers meeting. Well, the next morning, her son, W.C. White, who had a house not about half a block or block from where his mother was staying, he was walking to the tabernacle and walked by the place where Mrs. White was staying. And he had a couple of ministers with him, and he noticed the light was on in his mother's room. And he thought, well, maybe Mother's ill. I better go find out, check on her. So he went up, knocked on her door. There she was, all dressed, ready to go. She said the angel had awakened her about 3 that morning and that she should go to the meeting. So when they got to the tabernacle, just another block or two from where she was staying, they got to the tabernacle while the ministers were just getting up from prayer. And Elder Olson, the president, looked over and saw Mrs. White and her son and these 2 other ministers come in, and he's very startled because the last word he'd had from her the night before was, "I'm not coming." So he looks at her and he says, "Do you have something for us?" "Yes," she said, "I do. Indeed, I do." And she began to talk about a meeting that she had seen in vision. And in this meeting, she described how there was a discussion about taking the Seventh-day Sabbath truth out of our religious liberty paper, the American Sentinel. And she talked about how she had been shown that we should not do this. We must not hide our light. We must let people know who we are, and we need to leave the Seventh-day Sabbath in the American Sentinel. And so she talked about this vision that she'd had. And when she'd finished, a man stood up, one of the men in the congregation there, and said, "I was in that meeting last night when this was discussed." And he said, "I couldn't have described better what happened in the meeting than what you just heard." And another man stood up and said, "I was in that meeting last night also." Now it was Ellen White's turn to be surprised. Someone who was there recorded later that she looked just totally nonplussed by this. She couldn't believe it. She said, last night, I thought this meeting was held back when I had the vision in Salamanca, which was about 3 months earlier." Well, you can imagine that with this kind of evidence that we should leave the Sabbath in our religious liberty paper, guess what? They had another meeting of that little committee. The Sabbath that had been voted out a few hours earlier was now voted back into the American Sentinel, and it remained in our religious liberty paper as a witness to the holiness of God's 4th commandment, the Seventh-day Sabbath.